Hi, I'm Chuck at the Review Board, and this is a short introduction to the decision phase of the environmental assessment for developers. What happens in the decision phase? The Review Board gives its report of environmental assessment to the government decision makers. There are 3 government decision makers who make the final decision on the project, depending on where it is. If the project is on territorial lands, then the GNWT is the decision maker. If the project is on Tlicho government lands, then the Tlicho government is the decision maker. And if the project is on federal lands, then the federal government makes the decision. Some projects, like roads or power lines, can cross lands with multiple owners. These projects would have more than one decision maker. What is the report of environmental assessment? The main focus of the decision phase is the report of environmental assessment. This document is prepared by the Review Board to share its findings on if and how the project should go ahead. The report also has the reasons for the Review Board's decision. In the report, the Review Board says if the project is likely to cause impacts that matter and what should be done about them. The impacts that really matter are called significant impacts. Changes to reduce or avoid them are called mitigation measures. In its report, the Review Board recommends one of the following. Firstly, the Review Board determines whether or not the project should go ahead. Some projects have been rejected, but that's unusual. Secondly, if the Review Board recommends the project proceed, what changes or mitigation measures might be needed to avoid or reduce the impacts to make them acceptable? This is what happens most of the time. If the Review Board finds that the project will cause impacts that matter, which can be avoided even with mitigation, the project could be sent for more assessment. This is called a review panel, but this happens very rarely. What consultation happens during the decision phase? The GNWT and CERNAC represent the Crown. The GNWT Department of Lands and the Federal Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada are both responsible for Crown consultation. The Crown must consult with Indigenous governments and communities on the Review Board's recommendation. This is required by law under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. The Crown representatives will ask Indigenous governments and communities, could the project cause impacts to Indigenous treaty rights? During this phase, Indigenous governments and communities describe to the Crown if and how the project could impact treaty rights. Indigenous governments may recommend more mitigation measures beyond those found in the report of EA to address impacts to treaty rights. Indigenous governments and communities share their views on the adequacy of Crown consultation during the environmental assessment. What else happens during the decision phase? Federal and territorial government decision makers have 5 months to consult with Indigenous governments to make a decision on the environmental assessment. They have 3 options. First, they can accept the Review Board's report of EA recommendation along with any mitigation measures it contains to reduce or avoid the impacts. This is what happens most often. The second option is for decision makers to accept the Review Board's recommendation but request that the Review Board change some parts of the mitigation measures. This rarely happens. A third option is for the decision makers to tell the Review Board to reconsider its entire recommendation, but this is very rare. So what is the developer's role during the decision phase? Usually, the developer does not play a role during the decision phase. This is because the decision phase is the responsibility of the government decision makers. Unless rejected, the project proceeds to the regulatory phase once the government decision makers have either accepted the board's recommendation and measures, or required a consult to modify or reconsideration process. The decision phase is the final phase in an environmental assessment. The Review Board decides if the impacts from a project are significant or not, and makes a recommendation to the governments about what to do about them. Governments are ultimately the decision makers and decide whether to accept the Review Board's recommendation. Thanks.